By early 1945, the outcome of the Second World War was no longer in doubt. Germany was losing, and everyone knew it. But Adolf Hitler refused to accept reality. He believed that if he could make the Allies bleed hard enough, long enough, they'd lose the will to fight. In his mind, there would be no surrender. At the same time, the Allied powers were equally determined that there would be no negotiated peace. This war would not end with signatures on a treaty. It would end with the total destruction of Nazi Germany. As historian Robert Citino later wrote, World War II didn't end with a whimper, not even with a bang, but with a bloodbath. Proportionally, 1945 was the bloodiest year of the entire war. The overwhelming industrial might of the Allies now pressed deep into Germany itself. And many Germans were prepared to die rather than yield to an enemy they despised. In this two-part story, we'll explore how the Second World War in Europe truly came to an end. In this first episode, we'll focus on the Western Front, the battles, the strategies, and the final collapse of Nazi Germany. We'll examine objects, film, and photography from the Imperial War Museum collection to uncover how this chapter unfolded. How did the German military plan to defend its homeland? How did the Allies pull off a larger encirclement than even Stalingrad? And why didn't the Western Allies push all the way to Berlin? This is the story of Germany's downfall in the West. The future of Europe was still uncertain among the Western Allies. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill didn't trust Joseph Stalin, especially regarding Poland and the Balkans. He wanted to push Allied armies as far east as possible before the Soviets could occupy the region. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, on the other hand, had different priorities. He focused on building the post-war world order, particularly the formation of the United Nations, and believed that keeping a working relationship with Stalin was essential to lasting peace. But ultimately, the man who would decide how the war in the West ended wasn't a politician. It was a soldier, Supreme Allied Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower. Eisenhower was a disciplined professional to the core. His mission was clear: the total destruction of Germany's armed forces. By late January 1945, the Allies had crushed Germany's final offensive, the Battle of the Bulge. Though the cost was high, the Allies could replace their losses. The Germans could not. On the Eastern Front, the Red Army launched a massive offensive, advancing to within 40 miles of Berlin. That forced Germany to shift what little strength it had left away from the Western Front. This left the Western Allies with an overwhelming advantage: 5-2 in men and artillery, more than 3-1 in aircraft, and nearly 10-1 in tanks. Eisenhower planned to use that power decisively. He would concentrate his main effort in the north under Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's 21st Army Group, while General Omar Bradley's 12th Army Group and the 6th Army Group operated farther south. Together, they would encircle Germany's industrial heartland, the Ruhr, then drive into the open plains of northern Germany. But one massive obstacle still stood in their way: the River Rhine. Averaging 400 meters wide, the Rhine had long served as a natural barrier in German defense strategy. For Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the German commander in the West, it represented his final hope of halting the Allied advance. On paper, von Rundstedt commanded 80 divisions. In reality, most of them were hollow formations, some operating at barely 20% of their intended strength. His reserves were made up of the Volkssturm, a desperate militia of old men, young boys, and anyone unfit for regular military duty. Germany still had tanks and aircraft, but almost no fuel to run them. Von Rundstedt believed that Germany's only chance was to fall back behind the Rhine and use the river as a defensive wall. But Hitler refused. He would not surrender a single inch of German soil. Instead, he ordered von Rundstedt to stand and fight to the last man, everywhere, at any cost. It was a suicidal command, one that might delay defeat temporarily, but would ultimately accelerate Germany's destruction. Eisenhower's goal was to destroy as many German formations as possible before reaching the Rhine, to make the crossing easier when the time came. But first, the Allies had to break through the Siegfried Line, a 390-mile defensive system stretching from the Dutch border all the way to Switzerland. This line was fortified with bunkers, pillboxes, minefields, and concrete obstacles known as Dragon's Teeth. The Allies had breached parts of it the previous year, but now in 1945, they aimed to shatter it completely and sweep through the heavily industrialized Rhineland. On February 8, 1945, the final Western offensives of the war began. The Allies launched a two-pronged assault, Operations Veritable and Grenade. Initially, Operation Veritable, led by the British and Canadians, made solid progress. But Operation Grenade, led by the Americans, was delayed. Heavy rains and German demolition efforts had flooded the Roer River, forcing the Americans to wait. That delay allowed the Germans to redeploy reinforcements northward and stiffen their defense, leading to brutal attritional fighting. By late February, the water finally receded enough for Grenade to begin. With German reserves pulled north, the American advance surged forward. By March 10th, all remaining German units had retreated across the Rhine, destroying the bridges behind them. Further south, Bradley's 12th Army Group launched Operation Lumberjack on March 1st, exploiting crossings over the Erft River. The U.S. 1st and 3rd Armies drove rapidly toward the Rhine itself. Then came a stroke of luck that would change the course of the campaign. On March 7, 1945, elements of the U.S. 9th Armored Division reached the small German town of Remagen and were stunned to see the Ludendorff Railway Bridge still standing. Lieutenant Karl Timmerman and his men were ordered to seize it at once. They knew the bridge could be blown at any moment, but they charged ahead anyway. As they neared the structure, German engineers detonated the first explosive charge, creating a 30-foot crater at the entrance, cutting off tank support. A second explosion rocked the bridge, lifting it from its foundations. But when the smoke cleared, it was still standing. Under heavy fire, Timmerman's men sprinted across, cutting demolition wires and disarming charges as they went. Against all odds, they reached the far side and secured the bridgehead. Within 24 hours, 8,000 American troops had crossed the Rhine into the heart of Germany. The Germans realized what had happened and unleashed everything they had to destroy the bridge. Artillery airstrikes, even 11 V-2 rockets. But it held for 10 days before finally collapsing on March 17th, killing 28 U.S. soldiers and injuring 93. By then, though, the damage was done. American engineers had already built pontoon and treadway bridges nearby. The Allies now had a firm foothold east of the Rhine. With a foothold secured at Remagen, Eisenhower now had what every commander dreams of: momentum. The German defense on the Western Front was collapsing faster than anyone had imagined. But Eisenhower was cautious. He didn't want to rush forward recklessly. Instead, he ordered his armies to establish and expand their bridgeheads, preparing for a coordinated breakout. Soon more crossings followed. In the north, Montgomery's 21st Army Group was about to execute Operation Plunder, a massive assault across the Rhine near Wesel, supported by airborne drops under Operation Varsity. On March 23, 1945, the skis over the Rhine filled with transport planes and gliders. More than 16,000 paratroopers of the British 6th and U.S. 17th Airborne Divisions descended behind German lines. They faced fierce resistance, but quickly secured key bridges and roads. That same night, under a thunderstorm of artillery fire, British and Canadian forces stormed across the Rhine in landing craft. By dawn, they had secured the far bank. It was one of the largest and most successful river crossings in military history. In the south, General George S. Patton, commander of the U.S. Third Army, refused to be outdone. On March 22nd, he launched a surprise crossing near Oppenheim, without even waiting for orders. When Eisenhower asked Patton where he was, Patton reportedly replied, "Across the Rhine, and I didn't even need a damn bridge." By the end of March, Allied forces had crossed the Rhine at multiple points. The last great natural barrier protecting Germany had been breached. The German army, once feared across Europe, was now a shattered shadow of its former self. Yet Hitler refused to accept reality. In his bunker in Berlin, he raged at his generals, insisting that the Allies would soon collapse under internal division. He ordered counterattacks that no longer made sense. Divisions that existed only on paper, fueled by fantasy rather than fuel or ammunition. Meanwhile, German civilians faced the full horror of war. Cities were in ruins. Refugees streamed westward, desperate to escape the advancing Red Army. Millions were caught between two fronts, bombed from above, shelled from the east, and overrun from the west. Everywhere, the once proud Reich was disintegrating. By early April, Eisenhower saw an opportunity to trap the German army once and for all. The key lay in the Ruhr, Germany's industrial heart, a dense region of factories, mines, and railways that had powered the Nazi war machine. Eisenhower ordered Bradley's 12th Army Group to swing north and Montgomery's 21st Army Group to drive south. Their objective: encircle the Ruhr and cut off the German Army Group B. The trap closed quickly. By April 1st, the Ruhr pocket was sealed, trapping more than 325,000 German troops, the largest encirclement on the Western Front. Fighting continued inside the pocket for 2 more weeks, but with no supplies, no fuel, and no hope of relief. The German commander, Field Marshal Walter Model, saw the truth. On April 21st, he disbanded what was left of his army. A week later, he took his own life. The surrender of the Ruhr ended organized German resistance in the West. For the Allied soldiers, the war now became a race, not for glory but for prisoners. German units were surrendering by the tens of thousands. Columns of exhausted soldiers marched west, hands raised, hopping to find Americans or British troops before the Soviets reached them. For many civilians, the Allies' arrival meant survival, an end to years of bombings and starvation. For others, especially those complicit in Nazi crimes, it meant judgment was coming. As Allied troops advanced deeper into Germany, they began to uncover scenes that defied belief. The concentration camps, at places like Buchenwald, Bergen-Belsen, and Dachau, they found emaciated prisoners, piles of corpses, and the evidence of systematic murder on an industrial scale. For many soldiers, it was the first time they fully understood what they'd been fighting against. One American officer wrote, "You can't imagine it, you have to see it, and once you see it, you'll never forget it." These discoveries shocked the world and hardened the resolve to bring Nazi Germany to unconditional surrender. By mid-April 1945, the Western Allies had advanced all the way to the Elbe River, only 50 miles from Berlin. To their east, Soviet forces were preparing their own massive assault on the German capital. The Red Army would take Berlin, and pay a terrible price to do it. Eisenhower, however, had no intention of fighting his way into the city. He knew that Berlin had already been designated part of the Soviet occupation zone, and he saw no reason to lose tens of thousands of men for political theater. Instead, he focused on ending the war as quickly as possible, by crushing what was left of the German army in the south and linking up with Soviet forces advancing from the east. On April 25, 1945, near the small town of Torgau, American and Soviet troops met on the Elbe River. The handshake between Lieutenant William Robertson and Soviet Lieutenant Alexander Silvashk symbolized the final fracture of Nazi Germany. The Reich was split in two, and its end was now only days away. By late April 1945, the end had finally come. Germany, once a mighty empire that had conquered most of Europe, was collapsing from every direction. In the east, the Red Army was closing in on Berlin, block by block. In the west, American, British, and French forces were sweeping through Bavaria and southern Germany, destroying the last remnants of organized resistance. Everywhere, German units were surrendering by the tens of thousands. The once proud Wehrmacht was now little more than a desperate collection of exhausted men, fighting for a regime that no longer existed. Hitler had retreated deep underground into the Führerbunker, a concrete fortress beneath the shattered ruins of Berlin. There, surrounded by loyal aides, secretaries, and a handful of generals, he lived in a twilight world of delusion. He still moved pins on maps, ordering divisions that no longer existed to launch counterattacks that never came. Outside, Soviet artillery pounded the city day and night. The streets of Berlin had become a battlefield. Civilians, women, children, and the elderly fought alongside soldiers, armed with rifles, Panzerfausts, or sometimes nothing at all. SS units executed anyone who tried to flee. It was the final, suicidal act of the Third Reich. On April 29, 1945, as Soviet troops surrounded the city center, Adolf Hitler married his longtime companion, Eva Braun, in a brief civil ceremony inside the bunker. The next day, April 30th, he dictated his final will and political testament, still blaming Jews for the war and urging Germans to continue fighting. Then, in the afternoon, Hitler and Eva Braun retired to his private study. Moments later, a single gunshot echoed through the bunker. When aides entered the room, they found Hitler dead, a pistol in his hand and a cyanide capsule crushed between his teeth. Eva Braun had taken poison beside him. The bodies were carried into the garden, doused in gasoline and burned. The dictator who had promised a 1,000-year Reich had ruled for just 12 years and left his nation in ashes. With Hitler gone, Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz assumed control as the new head of state. But even he knew the war was lost. His only goal was to surrender to the Western Allies, hoping to save as many Germans as possible from Soviet captivity. On May 2nd, Berlin officially fell to the Red Army. 2 days later, the Germans in Italy surrendered. The following week, the final act began. At 7:41 p.m. on May 7th, 1945, in a small schoolhouse in the French city of Reims, German General Alfred Jodl signed the unconditional surrender of all German forces. The document would take effect the next day, May 8th. In Berlin, another ceremony was held on May 8th to satisfy Soviet demands for a formal signing before Marshal Georgy Zhukov. For the Allies, it was Victory in Europe Day, VE Day. After nearly 6 years of global conflict, the war in Europe was finally over. In the ruins of cities like Cologne, Dresden, and Berlin, the survivors emerged from their shelters, stunned, hollow-eyed, and unsure of what the future would bring. Germany lay in total ruin, its government destroyed, its economy shattered, its people starving, and its crimes exposed before the world. Millions of refugees wandered the roads of Central Europe. The displaced, the liberated, and the broken, all searching for a home that no longer existed. For the Allies, victory brought both relief and responsibility. They now faced the monumental task of rebuilding a continent devastated by war, and ensuring that such horror could never happen again. As General Eisenhower later said, "The mission of this great crusade has been accomplished. The menace has been destroyed." But the cost had been unimaginable. Over 60 million people dead, soldiers and civilians alike. Entire cities wiped off the map, and the shadow of the atomic bomb already looming on the horizon. The war in Europe had ended, but the world it left behind would never be the same again. From the ashes of the Third Reich rose two new superpowers: the United States and the Soviet Union. The uneasy alliance that had defeated Hitler would soon fracture into a new kind of conflict, one fought not with armies across continents, but with ideology, fear, and nuclear threat. The Second World War had ended. The Cold War had begun. This was how the deadliest conflict in human history came to a close. A war that reshaped nations, redrew borders, and changed forever what humanity believed itself capable of.